When I was doing research for the Curse of Cortez, for a while, I had a condo in Cancun.
Mm-hmm.
And when I would go off I'd have the condo, that was my base, but then I would go off on trips to explore ruins, go to try and find some research, go do a dive to see a dive location to get more information. And so I was kind of in and out a lot. And there was a guy named Shea Golan. Now, Shea was actually a Israeli criminal who was wanted by Interpol, wanted by the FBI for a number of major frauds and different things in the United States, who was in Cancun doing dirty work for the Zeta cartel and then conning Americans out of their condo. And what he would do is he would con his way into the condo and break in, and then basically refuse to leave and say, well, by Mexican law, you can't just get rid of me. So it'll take you 3 years to go through the legal process to get rid of me. In the meantime, I've got this beachfront condo that I'm going to live in. Well, I went on a trip. I came back. I caught him. I confronted him. He was a big guy. Had a Rottweiler guard dog and a hitman, or basically a bodyguard.
Mm-hmm.
And when I confronted him, he basically threatened to kill me, and said that if I messed with him, they'd find my body in the lagoon out back. Well, I was a street kid. I grew up on the streets. I didn't even think about it. I just went into, oh, hell, you didn't mode. And I basically told him that he had messed with the wrong gringo, and that if he didn't get his crap out of my place by the end of Sunday, which was 2 days away, that I would be back and all hell would break loose for him.
Listen to the vibes.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Listen to the Vibes, and I'm very privileged to have Mr. Guy Morris here with me today. Now, this man has led an extraordinary life, and I'd like to kick things off by you telling your story of how you got to the University of Arizona and earned your 3 degrees.
Well, that was, you're going way, way back. Okay. I had, like many, I had a bit of a rough childhood. I left home. I ran away from home 4 times before I was 15 years old. The longest one was for several months when I was 13. I was a homeless street kid in LA. And then I left home for good when I was 15. I was able to do that and get a GED because I had worked alongside a lot of migrant workers. So I used to go and follow, get in line and follow in the truck and go out to the ranch and work 12 hours, 15 hours. And then they would truck us back. But I had moved to Arizona at one point, and through a series of miracles, I had gotten married. And my first wife's father was a very successful businessman, owned his own plane, and had sold a company. And I think he must have seen some potential in me. And so I was actually my wife and I were actually praying one day about whether I should go look for another job, because the current job I had at the time was beating me up pretty bad. And I just got this enormous inspiration, and I call it a word from God. It says, I want you to get up right now and go to the university and ask for an application. I want you to go back to school. Now, I thought this was absolutely insane. I had no money. I was looking for a new job. I said, there's no way I could afford school. I barely even finished high school. I was not exactly the right candidate to be thinking. And I thought, okay, well, this is just a drug flashback coming back or something. I wasn't quite sure what to make of it at the time. But after it came a couple more times, I did. I got an application. I had never taken SAT scores, as I never thought I would ever go to college. I got an application a few days later. I needed my wife's help to fill out the application. I was like 25 some odd units deficient from the minimum requirements to get in. I had no idea what I was going to study because I hadn't really thought this through. And the more I was doing this, the more I thought, this is insane. What am I doing? They're just gonna laugh at me. And so, but I went through it. I sent it in, and no SATs, anything else. And but part of the process, but I had to get my transcripts and realize I'd already between kindergarten and the 10th grade, I'd gone to 16 schools.
Wow!
So I couldn't even remember most of them. I had no recollection of them. And so I thought, well, this is going to be a crash and burn disaster. But, it was kind of curious. So lo and behold, 2 weeks or so, 2 to maybe 3 weeks before school was supposed to start that semester, I was accepted into U of A. And basically saying that we'll let you make up your credits as you go along, your missing credits. Well, my first thought was, holy crap, I thought school was for people who actually did their homework and stuff like that. And they'll let anybody in college. I said, they're letting me in college. So, but I threw the acceptance letter in the trash because I still didn't have any money. I still was trying to find another job and look at that. And with unbeknownst to me, we had never said anything to anybody about this because I figured it was just going to burn. My father-in-law wrote me and basically said, I want you to consider, says, I know you're a hard worker, but I want you to consider going to college because I think you'd be a better provider and I think you'd have more of a chance at reaching your potential in life. And he says, I know this is, I don't want you to feel that I'm putting you down or that you don't have any worth as you are, but I want you to really seriously think about this. And I thought, and I'm willing to pay for tuition and books. You'll still have to work for your rent and other things. So I thought, well, holy crap, that was unforeseen. So I said yes. And frankly, the first couple of years, I was somewhat functionally illiterate. I was struggling. I was fighting just to get my C's and maybe an occasional B. But something clicked about halfway through. Something just started churning. I started getting faster at reading. I started getting better at everything. And I ended with the dean's list on the dean's list. Wow. And one of the things that I was taking fairly technical areas in finance and economics and, things that weren't minors in computer science, things that were not exactly easy. But one of the things we had to do to graduate was we had to build a macroeconomic model that would produce, forecast the GNP, the unemployment rate, and the interest rate into the future. And the professor, who was the dean of the college, was going to grade on a curve. So the closer you got to the actual numbers, the better grade you got in the class. And so I wanted to go to grad school at that point. This was my undergrad, not necessarily a thesis, but what most of my grade was going to be based on. And it was a culmination of everything that we had learned over 4 years. And these are fairly complex models, dozens and dozens of algorithms, nonlinear regression analysis, all working together, bouncing off each other. And so I went into him and I said, I want to kind of deal with you. I want to go to grad school. I said, if I get the best grade in the class, if I get closer than anybody else in the class, I want you to think about maybe sponsoring me for a scholarship. Mm-hmm. And he agreed. I was his pain in the butt student. I always asked 10 times more questions than anybody else until I was given a quota. I only got it allowed. He said, okay, you get 3 per class now. And he would say, now, are you sure this is one of your 3? Are you sure you want to wait on this one? Is this one of your 3? And so the bottom line is I went into an obsessive mode. I was at the data center usually from about midnight to 8 a.m. For months until I actually wore myself down and got sick. And so I was having a hard time graduating because I was so sick at that point. But my model came back and I not only beat out everybody in the class, but I beat out the Federal Reserve. I beat out all the major banks. I beat out every major university. And it was by a long shot. Most of them were a percentage or 2% off of the actual number, and I was 0.1% off the actual number for 2 quarters in a row.
Wow.
And I did it because I was trying to prove that they were all missing something based on a theory that I had developed that had to do with technology and productivity. And so my model became the standard within the Federal Reserve. And for years in the 80s and 90s, latter part of the 80s and 90s, we all heard the Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker at the time, talk about the productivity gains of technology within the economy. Mm-hmm. And all of that was based on the model that I had developed.
Wow.
So I not only got my scholarship, but I was also accepted into Harvard. I didn't have the money to go to Harvard. I couldn't move to Harvard. I had a wife and a daughter at the time. I couldn't move everybody out, and I had no infrastructure out there to get a job. And so I wound up giving up on that dream, but I did get a scholarship. IBM hired me out of that role right away. So I immediately started getting offers from Fortune 100 technology and other companies that felt that I had a pretty good handle on their business in that sense. So that started me. So that got me through to college. And then when I graduated, I started working with Fortune 100 companies right away, and worked with IBM and Oracle and Microsoft over the years. I worked with a big oil company, Occidental, before they were sold out. When the original chairman, Armin Hammer, was still there, I did billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions. I transitioned the company to PC-based, program-based budgeting systems, and actually wrote the program myself and transitioned them. I had the access to incredible geologic models, so I built my own programs, basically trying to calculate the probability of prophecies coming to pass in these days. So I was always now, and also during all those years, I never liked, I'm not very good with idle time. I don't watch a lot of TV. And so I earned a charter captain's license. I lived on a big 50-foot sailing yacht at the time, and with my son. And so I earned a charter captain's license. I went diving with sharks. I did songwriting for Disney. I led worship teams in a couple of different churches, including Venice Beach, California, which was a fun place to be in general. Wrote screenplays for a pilot screenplays for a friend who had a film production studio, a small production studio, and went diving with sharks without cages. I went exploring Latin America and the ruins, and had a lot of adventures down there that led to one of the books I wanted to talk about today with the and so, yeah, I was in boardrooms during the time when the chairman of the board basically went into a tirade and threatened to fire anybody who talked about climate change years before anybody knew what that was. So I've had a number of really interesting experiences that brought me into direct contact with the FBI and generals in government, and director of flight operations for NASA and major leaders in business. And so I've led a very interesting life, and I'm very grateful that I had that. All of that sprung from me basically just saying, I'm going to take this wild ass shot in the dark, and I'm going to say, okay, I'll fill it out. Don't laugh at me. I'll fill out the application, but please be gentle. And they accepted it.
Wow.
Lo and behold.
That is just absolutely incredible. Can we go back and talk about the prophecies a little bit? Because that's something I'm really interested in.
Well, at the time, this was back in the 90s at that point, because I was still at the oil company. I've been a student of prophecy for many years, and it's really kind of gelled at that point. I had read prophecies in Revelations about the seven trumpets, where a third of the fish of the sea would die, a third of the birds of the air would die, things of that nature.
Mm-hmm.
And for many years, like many people in churches, the emphasis is on the allegory, the flaming rock from the sky that somehow creates these events. I decided to take a different approach. I said, well, let me focus on the actual outcomes of, forget the allegory, and to see how I can attribute things that have actual outcomes and which of those have already come true. And I should be able to calculate the probability of some of those things coming true, starting with the first time ever in recorded human history on any continent that a world body in 1948 would decide that they were going to take a people that had been scattered around the world for 2,000 years, and they were going to basically create a homeland for them.
Right.
Which started a whole spiral of other events and other things happening as well. But the probability of that happening relative to human history and thousands of different nations that have come and gone, and peoples and cultures and things that have come and gone, was really quite astounding. And so I started thinking about prophecy in a probabilistic, in a mathematical way. And so I actually went through, I used millions of years of geologic data in my study. I went through and I identified roughly about 15 or so prophecies. And I was actually reading a National Geographic magazine. And it was talking about, and there were others that I had read. I used to read National Geographic religiously, and there were other articles that talked about loss of flocks, especially migrating birds that no longer did, loss of fish stocks in all the major fishing grounds around the world, from Asia to Americas. Species loss. And there was a book that came out about 10 years ago called The Sixth Extinction, and talking about all the species loss we had. I said, well, there's probabilities to those things happening as well. You can obviously point to that kind of stuff after an asteroid or maybe a super volcano. But what about the probability of these things happening outside of that? And so I started, basically, I developed this idea that I would take one prophecy, I developed the probability. I would say, okay, what's the probability of that, plus this, plus this, plus this, plus this, and I chained them all together and came out with an astounding number of essentially 1 in 1.4 trillion that these things were random. Now, this was over a very long weekend. I was a single parent. My son was at my ex-wife's house at the time. I didn't have any money to go dating. I had this bug up my fanny to kind of figure this out. And I walked away thinking, that's an incredible number. Even if my math and my techniques, if I did something wrong, even if I'm off by a factor of 10, that's still an incredibly compelling number. And so I started looking at prophecy, world events, politics, climate, everything that I could. I started looking at through this probability and sort of filter lens, that basically. So, because I was in the church, and there was certainly for a time, there was a lot of hype that we had entered the last days that kind of dragged out and lost its luster as churches started to try and go more for growth and profits and all those things. But I never lost that. I was always deeply aware that we certainly lived in unprecedented dynamic time period. Right, between space travel, knowledge, computers, satellites, AI, medicine, every aspect of life, we can basically say that we live in a very one-of-a-kind, unique time in all of human history.
Yeah.
And so I started looking at all of those things and trying to not be reactionary to the least littlest thing, like some might be, but I tried to basically put together the patterns. I tried to figure out how the dots connected. What are the things that are leading to other things? And so that actually became part of one of my first novels that I wrote, called The Swarm. And The Swarm is based on, it deals with artificial intelligence, advanced technologies, most of them moving faster than our ability to control them, either legally or morally, how that relates to some of the things that are happening in prophecy. And the wonderful story that I love to tell people, the inspiration for that whole series began when I stumbled on a very short 2-paragraph Associated Press article, and I can't remember if it was Scientific American or Omni or one of the pseudo well-respected science magazines. And the article simply said that a program had escaped the Lawrence Livermore Laboratories at Sandia, which is an NSA spy lab. And then if I knew something, to contact either this professor in charge of the program or this FBI agent in charge of the investigation. That was it. I couldn't find anything else in any other magazine, anywhere, at any time. That was the only thing I could ever find about that. And I cut it out and I taped it to my monitor for months, basically saying, okay, that's weird. So either somebody's going to get fired for that typo, or somebody's going to get fired for saying something they weren't supposed to say.
Right.
A program wasn't lost, it wasn't stolen, it wasn't corrupted, it didn't fail to operate. They could have used a dozen different verbs in there, but they used the word escape. Now, escape implies intent, escape implies intelligence, and escape implies the ability for the program to move itself and then erase its trail of where it went so that they don't know where it went. And I thought, that is amazing technology. That is so freaking cool. I said, then I started thinking, okay, well, how would that happen? If I were a program developer how would I have to architect this that it could, are there any other examples in web crawlers and other technologies that I could say, if I used a very advanced version of that technology, I could explain these things.
Right.
And so I spent the first few months basically researching technologies. How could this happen? Right? How could a program physically escape? And once I felt that I had a scenario that was advanced, but realizing that the government in terms of research is typically 5 to 10 years ahead of commercial, I said, okay, well, that seems plausible at least. Well, then I asked myself, I said, okay, well, that's a pretty amazing capability in and of itself. It must have been designed to do something so that it could basically sneak around and move itself and stay invisible. I said, well, what would I want my perfect 007 spy program to do? So I went ahead and I said, well, and I went through my data center and my office and all kinds of other places and devices. And I basically came up with a list of things that I would want my program to be able to do that. Things like spoofing your keyboard, turning on your webcam without turning on the camera so you didn't know it was on, turning on your phone mic so you wouldn't know it's on, reversing the polarity of your monitor. So basically I could get a sort of almost like a negative image of what's going on in your office. All kinds of things like that. And one of them was basically what we now call the deepfake video technology, to be able to take your analog voice or image, digitize it, manipulate it so I can make you say or look like you're saying something you didn't say or do.
Right.
And which would be extremely useful if I wanted to basically hack somebody's email or ID or password, to basically, you're this, I'm going to call up, pretend to call up somebody's secretary and say, Alice, I can't remember my password again. And that kind of thing. So I thought it was really cool. It was really fun. A friend of mine was a film producer. We talked about a pilot for it. We talked about a pilot screenplay. At the time, the webisode series were really popular, and it was very early stages back when AOL actually still existed. And so we said, well, let's make a webisode series out of this. We hired out-of-work actors. We wrote scripts. We produced it. We did all the programming to put up a show. Super popular show. Fans from all over the world, including the director of flight operations from the Houston Space Center. And a movie studio basically bought an option to basically license the show. 2 weeks before the license is supposed to go into effect, I have 2 FBI agents show up at my door. Wow. Rather perturbed that I had figured out something they thought should be top secret. I said, well, you just need to hide it better. Not my fault that I'm smart. So they wanted me, of course, to take the show down. I laughed at them. I said, no, this is my meal ticket. So they went to the studio and they killed the deal. I tucked my tail between my legs and ultimately went and got a job with Oracle. But that was the beginning of the series. Now, one of the things fictionally then in the series is that I now have taken that program to a state of sentient singularity, which means that it's self-aware and as smart as a smart human. So if a smart human knows how to program a new AI, or if a smart human knows how to hack into something, or if a smart human knows how to do something, an AI should be able to do it. And then I had that AI do what I did, do a quantitative analysis. And so the AI has now decoded end time prophecy in the story and is trying to communicate these things and what's going on to the other characters, most of whom were somewhat agnostic. Maybe they had some religious background when they were young and rejected. Maybe they didn't have any, and they don't really have any framework at all on this. But most of the characters in the story don't really understand what the program is trying to tell them and what it means by some of these things that it's saying, other than it's just really weird for an AI to look like it's found a religion of some kind. And so it becomes a really great vehicle for me to talk about modern day events in climate, food shortages, water shortages, politics, economics, all of space, all of the things, other artificial intelligence, banking. It becomes a really great vehicle through the AI's perspective to deal with dozens of different world crises and then put them somehow in alignment with and from an AI perspective, prophecy is not about how an external entity is going to destroy the humanity, but how humanity is kind of doing it itself.
Yeah. Okay.
And so there's a morality that kind of comes into it that you wouldn't normally get in something like an iRobot or a HAL 2001. And because the program had this deep fake video technology, the program can basically assume various personas. It has a default persona of a young British girl in the 1960s, but could imitate a president or a CEO or a Danny DeVito or whoever it wants to in terms of its ability to communicate with us. And so it becomes a very engaging, likable, almost humorous in a sense at times, character in how it chooses to use human communications to communicate back to humans. And so it can be both insightful. It can basically repeat something that somebody said in their own image. So it's like watching a mirror of you basically saying something you said, but now you basically don't mean it. And the computer's going to catch you off on it. So, but that allowed me to talk about a lot of prophetic elements that are going on today. And so the theme of the book is that all of these politics and artificial intelligence and weapons and everything else going on are going on, but with behind that scene, there's a filter of how is this basically telling us of where we're going and where we're at in that track, and how do we respond to that is really what the characters are having to ultimately decide. If that is true, how do I change my priorities? How do I change my approach to life? How do I change how I deal with other people? How do I change what that might mean for me? And not in a dystopic way, because I'm trying to kind of avoid that kind of darkness. But our characters are witty, they're intelligent, they have good relationships, although they're faulty and dysfunctional at times. And so they're I avoid the sort of the typical hero of a CIA or Navy SEAL who's trained to kill you 7 ways before breakfast, sir. And our hero instead is a traumatized foster kid from California, but he's a genius hacker, now working as an NSA contractor, living under the name of a deceased best friend who died. He's basically under a false identity, a stolen identity, because his best friend died in an explosion that was meant for him after he had hacked a Bilderberg Illuminati server. And so we set up some of these more global types of aspects in the story as well. So it's the prophecy theme is something, as I said, I've been studying for many years, but I've started communicating it within the book rather than your typical religious dogma and doctrinal perspective, more from a social, mathematical, analytical perspective of world events equals, prophecy, fulfilled. What are the probabilities? Therefore, it's not random.
Right. Well, I'm a Christian, and back in the mid 90s is really when I got into church and actually preached for about 5 years.
Excellent.
And it just seems like every generation you get that this is the end times now. Look at what's happening. Look at what's happening. Now I don't think I have an argument against it because there's so much that you read in the book of Revelation that seems like it's happening now. Like good being evil and evil being good and so on and so forth.
All kinds, exactly.
I have a theory, and I don't know, I may be way off base here, but I think that the beast is actually computers or even the web itself. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, there are actually 2 beasts mentioned in Scripture, and that's a piece that a lot of people miss. There's a beast of the land, which is, without going through all the details, looks like it's probably a common. And when I think beasts, I'm now thinking in terms of alliances, right? What we now would, alliances are not something that you would have seen back 2,000 years ago, but it's something that's a framework that we see today.
Right.
So you've got Russia, Iran, China as a primary, and with a little bit of Turkey, but primary alliances between those 3. And that explains a lot of the beast of the land and what they do. And the beast of the land creates an image of the second beast that they control. The second beast is the one that most people are aware of, has 7 heads, 10 horns, 10 crowns.
Right.
My interpretation of that, and one of the things I've already said about prophecy is written in a way where you can't necessarily predict into the future what it will look like. You can only interpret it once it actually exists and it matches up, right? So the beast of the beast with the seven heads and everything else, for many years, people had all kinds of really weird drawings and art about it, with a leopard or a lion with seven heads and horns, and they completely confused the issue. But now we can look at look at alliances, and we can look at world economies, we can look at banking, we can look at military, all of the systems in the world, and we can see a G7 economies that are basically control most of that. Underneath that G7, the extended alliance to that there's still 10 monarchies. When you look at the EU and that alliance, there's actually 10 monarchies that still exist. So you've got your 10 crowns. And if you look at the horns, that's a horn in my mind is either going to be a financial center or a military center. Basically, the horn has the ability to strike. The horn has power. And you see that as well. So I look at that and I see, well, the United States is part of that.
Mm-hmm.
So we're not out separate. We're not some sort of, we're not on some big giant country that's basically looking at all these happening elsewhere. We're actually right in the middle of it. And that awareness that we can't look at flag, we can't look at partisan politics, we can't associate ourselves with those things because they become idols in this last day. And this message to the seven churches is sort of the guideline that I use to talk about, well, how should we be behaving? What are the things we need to look at within ourselves and within our own community and family to try and change and repent from? And so the message to the seven churches really becomes that foundation. And so I start looking at all of those different aspects in the book and in prophecies to say, well, what are the characteristics? What modern technology, alliance, institution, global policy, what is it that actually aligns to that I can point to today? And so, and again, I was the same way. Many ages have said that, we're in the end times. And they would pick one or two things. Typically, there's corruption in government. Well, there's always been corruption in government, right? Typically, that people are being immoral. Well, ever since the Romans were pretty immoral. I mean, we've always had parts of society that were immoral.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to kind of separate it between two things. One is it the kind of thing that's been around for forever, but now we're just magnified it towards a worldwide phenomenon. And at a level where it's never really existed before. So it's way over the top of what it used to be, right? So we can look at worldwide pornography as kind of that kind of scenario, right?
Right.
So yeah, we've had immoral. There was a lot of brothels in the West. There was a lot of immorality throughout all of the history, but it's now kind of taken on a whole tone of its own. Or we can look at things that, well, that's never actually existed before. We never would have known how to describe that before other than allegorical terms. And now you can look at weapons systems, the internet, banking systems, space exploration, artificial intelligence, quantum technology, gene splicing. You can now look at all of these things that never, ever existed in any format before until this one generation.
Yeah.
And so you can separate when you're looking at prophecy. I'm always looking at, well, is this one of those, is it worse than it's ever been prophecies? Or is it one of those, it's never been before prophecy? And so I try to separate, and that deals with probabilistic models. But that's how I kind of tend to look at it.
Yeah. I mean, look, social media, we never would have even thought about that as kids. It's all new.
The fact that I can pick up my cell phone and I can call somebody all the way around the world. The kind of communications, the kind of seeing all of the world events going on in real time is a new phenomenon for us. It's only been this generation. So that has to do all with my Swarm and my Last Ark series. So I infused those books, all of the books really, with a lot of reality to try and make it seem more plausible. So, for example, in my latest book, The Last Ark, one of the prophecies for many is that there'll be a third temple. I'm not 100% convinced that will actually happen, as opposed to speaking to what happened in 70 AD. But I take the premise of saying, well, if it were to happen, What are the world events that might say that we're leading up to that, right? That might be possible. Now, for a temple, and especially in Jerusalem, the temple was all about temple worship, temple sacrifice. So a temple without an ark is kind of meaningless. So you have a lot of problems to solve. You have, well, could a temple actually exist on this temple platform and without destroying the Dome of the Rock? Is the Dome of the Rock really where Solomon's temple was, or is there evidence to say that it was elsewhere on the temple platform? Of the arks that are known to exist, can we get to any of them? Or is there any way to actually have an ark in temple worship? And it turns out all three of those things can be answered. And that's why I do a lot of research. Most people are not aware. But the Ark of the Covenant, most people are aware that there's a legend of the Ark of the Covenant that's been in Ethiopia, basically transitioned there 2,600 years ago under Solomon's son Menelik, who went with 500 temple priests. They first set up a temple on Elephant Island in the Nile. The years of papyri that have been found to verify it, they found the temple ruins. The Romans basically kicked them out in the 2nd century. And then they went to Ethiopia, where it was in synagogues for many centuries until the Crusaders came through, the Templars came through and moved it into Christian churches. But it's been there, guarded by a guardian for many, many generations. Now, some will argue, well, that's not the ark made by Moses. We'll get to that one in a second. But it was used in temple worship and for many generations. And so it was a legitimate ark for that purpose. And so in January 21, this is a piece most people aren't aware of. 750 men, women, and children were massacred, including the guardian, protecting the ark before it was stolen and sold on the black market. So the ark is no longer in Axum, Ethiopia anymore. There are some that basically say some other obscure church has it, but that's never been confirmed. The people who stole it never have mentioned it. So what it tells me is that if they wanted to destroy the culture of Axum, they could have easily destroyed the ark, blasted pictures all over everything and say, see, it's dead now. It's done. It has no power. It's nothing holy. It's just a bunch of old scrap wood now. Or they could have basically legitimized it themselves and said, now I have this power. Now I own this relic. Neither of those things happen. So somebody bought it on the black market. So I postulate in my mind who has the power, who's set up from a prophecy perspective to maybe have to own that, who would want an ancient Jewish relic. So let's put that aside for a moment. I also bring into the story, it's the true story of the Copper Scroll. In the 1960s, there was a Copper Scroll found where the other Dead Sea Scrolls were near Qumran on the Dead Sea. In the Copper Scroll, it took them years to unravel it without breaking it and clean it and decipher it. And it had 5 different, different separate handwritings. One of them was Barak, the scribe for Jeremiah. And it told of 64 locations where a temple priest had hidden billions and billions of dollars, many tons of gold and treasures from the temple before the Babylonian invasion. In the 64th location was a second Copper Scroll that described where Jeremiah hid the ark made by Moses. So for 50 years, people have been looking all over Jerusalem to try and find these locations and failing miserably and making the excuse of, well, Jerusalem's been rebuilt too many times. There's no way we're ever going to find these locations. About 6 or 7 years ago, an American, ironically, decoded all 64 locations underneath the ruins of Qumran itself, went to Israel, convinced the Israeli archaeology, the Sanhedrin and the Israeli Archaeology and Antiquities group to go out and do a metal scan. The metal scan confirmed non-ferrous gold, silver type metals under each of their locations, but they can't, it's about 9 to 12 feet down. They can't dig there because that's part of the Palestinian West Bank. And so you now have a peace solution. You have to basically create a certain type of peace deal. Ironically, that would go for a single state solution, which is when Israel started transitioning to talk about single state solution was about the time they learned about that this treasure was underneath Qumran. So in my book, The Last Ark, I bring in these 2 artifacts. I bring in the politics of the area, including the crown prince, who has envisioned himself and tries to sell himself as the Islamic Mahdi, which is their version of a Messiah. But the Islamic tradition has that before their version of the Mahdi will come, the Dajjal, which is their version of an Antichrist, will come. And so I play through all of these scenarios with this peace deal, with these artifacts, combining it with, I speculate, I have to say fictional because I don't want to upset anybody, and it's a fictional, but what would happen if a former US president under criminal indictment decides that he doesn't want to go to trial, but instead he flees to Arabia where he declares asylum, where he and the crown prince, who's his buddy, decide to restart this peace deal. That becomes sort of political theater.
Right.
So I try to pull from real world stuff. I try to, Ukraine's going on at the time, which provides motivation for Moscow to get involved. There's all kinds of layers that you can weave into that just simply by looking at, well, if these facts about the Ark are true, let me do some fictional what if scenarios and see, bouncing off some of the world events, well, how would that play out in that scenario? And so all of that will go back to, it's the probabilities that two arcs that have both been basically hidden behind walls or hidden in general and forgotten for thousands of years were to be able to come to light in the same generation, the same decade, thousands of years later. It becomes a probability issue. How likely is that to happen, especially if it's happening with all these other things? Is it by chance, or is there some sort of connection there? That make sense?
Yeah, surprisingly, yes. I'm wondering if I'm going to need to go get a degree to read the book now.
No, it'll. I write it in a really easy sort of dialogue kind of way, so that you lay out one little piece at a time. Becomes a lot. Nobody who's ever read or reviewed the book felt that it was over their head. I simplify things in a very fun, easy way, and so you can kind of capture this stuff and get little nuggets as it goes through the story. So I've been compared a lot to Dan Brown for that reason.
Oh, wow.
So most often Dan Brown, but also Tom Clancy, Robert Ludlum, and others. Now, one of the stories that I mentioned, you were talking about paranormal, but one of the journeys, and you haven't asked, I don't know if you want me to talk about that.
Sure.
One of the other books that I wrote is called The Curse of Cortez, and that started as a short story for my son. And the true piece of history that got me obsessed with researching this question, and I'll keep it short, but essentially Henry Morgan in 1672 raided the city of Panama, pulled back 30 tons of plunder, $1 billion worth of plunder, 600 slaves, cheated all of his men, disappeared with everything on 3 ships that were never seen again. But Morgan survived, so he knew what happened to it or where he had gone. It wasn't sunk because he got home. And so when he got to Jamaica, they sent him to England, where they thought he was a hero. They said, we're going to knight you, Sir Henry Morgan. And they're going to go back to Jamaica and get rid of piracy. Well, when he got back to Jamaica as lieutenant governor, he had a garrison of soldiers, all the power in the world. He went into this haunted, drunken, depressed debauchery and burned his logbooks so the world would never know what happened. 3 years after he died, the whole city of Port Royal sinks into the ocean, including his grave. At the time, many of the locals swore that they had been cursed by Morgan. So I was hooked by that story. I thought that is not only a cool story, but it raises a lot of questions. First question was, it's not easy to lose 30 tons of stuff, 3 ships, 500 bodies. Somebody found something. And in fact, in 1911, a British explorer, more like treasure hunter, named F.A. Mitchell Hedges, did find something. F.A. Mitchell Hedges is famous for finding the Crystal Skull in Honduras, which is a 50-mile journey away off the coast from that island. So it's very close to that. And before he had found, disappeared overnight with tons of gold, lots of gold, like $6 million worth at the time, about 250 million worth today, he had claimed that he had found Atlantis. Now, everybody laughed him to scorn at the time. But the other thing, so I figured out where it happened. And so the more I did research about that location, I realized that Henry Morgan's uncle, Edward Morgan, had conquered that island 40 years before Panama, turned it into a raging pirate base. So Henry knew everything, all the caves, all the extra islands, smaller islands, everything really well. It had caves on it. To this day, there's caves on the east side part of that island where the locals won't go because of rumors that it's haunted by spirits. That was another big clue for me. I then tied that island back to an Inquisition massacre that ended a 2,000-year pilgrimage to the island before anybody said, hey, why are people canoeing 50 miles out here? That's a long canoe to come out for pilgrimage. What happened here that people are trying to come here?
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing, I ultimately tied that pilgrimage to the 5,000-year Mayan calendar and the Mayan creation myth. The actual legitimate physical origins, the event that happened in real geologic history that was the birth of the Mayan creation myth, or at least part of it. So all of that really kind of spread together to bring in a what BookTrib called Indiana Jones meets Da Vinci Code story. And but part of that is one of the clues that I found in my research with Morgan is that he was a ruthless, vicious, greedy, bloodthirsty, amoral SOB, but he was also hyper superstitious. And so the link between the Mayan creation myth, the link between the spirits in these caves that the locals were afraid of, the reticence of F.A. Mitchell Hedges to talk about, and even in his own memoirs, he wouldn't talk about where he found the gold and how he found it. So everybody basically being afraid to talk about this experience of where this stuff was, that spurred me to do even more research and more, and that's where I run the research. I had this epic story I had to write into a really condensed, really tight action thriller like a Dan Brown novel.
Wow.
And so you're uncovering a lot of these things in the Dan Brown. And so I postulate that let's say some of these spirits are real within these caves.
Mm-hmm.
Are they based on the experience of the massacre that must have happened between the slaves and the Henry Morgan's other crew that were obviously massacred so he could protect the location of where he buried this treasure? Or was it based on the event that actually started the Mayan creation myth, which connects to the 13,000-year asteroid that hit that started the Younger Dryas? So in the Mayan creation myth, when Cortez landed in Aztec in the 1500s, they told him that they were on the fourth incarnation of the world. That their myths had basically said that the world had been created and destroyed 3 other times before.
Mm-hmm.
I started saying, well, what if they're linking that back to the 5,000-year calendar to say for this 5,000-year period, we were destroyed this way. In the prior 5,000 10,000 years ago, we were destroyed this way. And when I started tying all that back, I realized that the asteroid was right smack dab in the middle of the period where they said that man was made of wood, wouldn't worship God, so he destroyed them with fire and a flood. Mm-hmm. And a fire basically directly related to the plasma runoff that would have happened in a major asteroid that burned the fire, and we have the black char of fires that burned all over North America, all the way down to Colombia. So they have the fires that started as a result of this asteroid, and then because of that fire and the heat from the plasma, that was what caused the up here in the Northwest, we talk about the Missoula Lake that basically drained through the Badlands, through Idaho, out through Oregon. That basically was also part of that. That would have come from the heat. We have the Clovis peoples. We have a number of species that went extinct, like the saber-tooth and the mammoth, and a number of other things that went extinct at that time. Other cultures went extinct. And so that event basically related to the Mayan creation myth. And so that type of intense heat in plasma, there is a scientific principle called magnetic mirrors. Mm-hmm. That basically says that we can, it's just like we record audio tracks using magnetized tape.
Right.
There's a way of capturing some of that using some of the magnetic mirror, and stone, especially vulnerable stones or porous stones like lava and basalt, will actually reflect the polarity of what was going on at the time during that time, including what some of these plasma events. And so that could have captured some of that horrific human suffering. I postulate that what if that had captured some of the horrific human suffering within these underground caves that were basically part of that asteroid event, and how that reflected back some of those things in a way that a guy like Henry Morgan would say, no way I'm going back there ever again. And so that was the premise. That was the inspiration for what became the Curse of Cortez story.
There's a theory in the paranormal world that like the even the wood, stone, things like that, that they're like a video recorder, and what you're seeing is just reflections of what has already happened. I mean, there's so many different theories of what ghosts are. I'd love to explore that more, but man, I love what you're doing. Oh man, I would say it'd be a movie, but there's so much information. It'd have to be a series. It'd probably be season after season to get all that information in there.
Yeah, there's no way I could get the whole story in a single 90-minute movie, but it would make a great series, a great adventure kind of thing that you could do. And the book actually won a semi-finalist for cinematic book in 2019.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And
So yeah, it's a great story. I like to call it Indiana Jones meets Goonies for grown-ups, but with a splash of Stephen King. To kind of get you kind of some of the themes and the characters and how they play out and how they interact with this whole story. Because I try to keep it, there's certainly elements of the story where you grip your seat and you're terrified and wondering what's going to happen next. There's other elements of the story where there's humor and wit and adventure and discovery and a little bit of romance here and there. So it has it's a well balanced type of story that way.
Well, it sounds like a book you just couldn't put down.
That's my hope. That's my hope.
And you wrote music. I mean, you even have CDs and
I do. I was a musician for a long time. For a while, I had my own recording studio. When I moved up here with Microsoft, I was making enough money and I had a big enough house I could do that. For a while, I was when I was living on the yacht, I did contract writing for Disney. And that was an interesting experience. They would call you up on a Tuesday or Wednesday and say, we want 5 songs by next Tuesday. And so you'd have to write the songs, find somebody, a studio that could squeeze you in at the last minute and for multiple hours and kind of bang out the demos of these things so they can hear it. And sometimes you won the job or you won a spot on the project, or sometimes you didn't. And the pay wasn't super great. It was certainly prestigious. But it was an interesting experience to take the process of songwriting, which I had been writing songs for years, and turn it into a sort of a production process to say, okay, now here's the theme for song 1, here's the theme for song 2, here's the theme for song 3, and try and write that out and get that going in a pretty quick way. So that was interesting. I was on a couple of Scary Songs projects, and I was on a Dinosaurs project. I was asked to bid on a Little Mermaid project. I couldn't quite get into my 13-year-old girl mode fast enough. There was an Aladdin project, different types of things. And most of these are projects where they would get a bunch of new songs, not songs, the Elton John songs where they had real high royalties on, but they would get other artists to write songs, and they would make a cassette or, it turned into a CD for a while, and they'd sell it with a toy.
Right? Oh, wow.
So you get your Little Mermaid doll and you get your Little Mermaid cassette, right? So was good for a while. I ultimately quit it because I didn't, I just had a real job at the time and I had a lot going on, and I got tired of basically having my chain yanked at the last minute. But yeah, it was real interesting. And I recorded a few of my own CVs, including Christmas albums and a kids album, and different types of themes, and including worship and all kinds of ones.
Yeah. Well, you've wrote programs, you've wrote books, you've wrote music, you've done all these things. And from what I read, you even swam with the sharks.
Yes, I love diving, and I used to go diving in California, off the coast of California a lot, but it was cold water. And so I would go down to the Caribbean to go diving. On one of the characters in The Curse of Cortez is a seaplane pilot named Chico. Chico is based on a real pilot, and his seaplane was, I'm not even sure how it could float, much less fly. But he duct taped that thing together. I don't know what he did to it, but he was able to get it up and down. When I first met Chico and I first saw his plane, my first thought, honest to God, my first thought was, okay, so this is how I die, But I also had a friend who she was wealthy. She grew up in Malibu. Her parents had a lot of money. They owned property all over LA. And she was a bit of a bohemian. And she bought a motu, an island outside of Bora Bora in the Polynesia. And so I would go shark diving down there. And down there, what they would do is we wouldn't use cages. We would take the lead would basically buy a few big tunas for the day and cut them all up so they were nice and bloody. And one person would go and they would stand and they basically hold this big giant tuna over their head. And the first thing that happened is you'd get one of these fish tornado things, basically thousands of fish basically going around in a circle around this person, nibbling at this piece of tuna. And then you'd see about a dozen or so. We'd ultimately be one, then two, then a dozen sharks, bull sharks, mako sharks, tiger sharks would basically come and circle around this thing. And then they would basically go through this tornado and open their mouth at the last minute and come out at the end with a fish in their mouth. Wow. And so it was a really incredible experience because when your turn to basically hold the fish, you're surrounded by a bazillion fishes all nibbling at this piece of fish, raw meat that you have. And every few seconds or every few minutes, you'd get this giant shark just swim right over your head, basically looking for bait. And if you weren't holding the fish, you were basically laying on the ground in a circle around all of this going on. And you would get a shark basically just sail right by you or right over your head or right from behind you, basically kind of checking this out. So it was probably one of the most exhilarating experiences I've ever had.
Yeah, that's
incredible. And I talked about it for years. I wish at the time I didn't buy one of those underwater cameras because at the time they were kind of expensive. Now after that I thought, well, I regretted it. I wanted to have had cameras of all of this and shots of all of this so I can show people. But yeah, it was one of those great experiences that I was real happy to, one of those honors. You don't really get to do that very often. And it's one of those things that sticks out.
Wow. And okay, so a while ago you told me you were visited by the FBI, but I guess probably more scarier than that, you were threatened by the cartel.
When I was doing research for the Curse of Cortez, I had a condo in Cancun.
Mm-hmm.
And when I would go off I'd have the condo that was my base, but then I would go off on trips to explore ruins, go to try and find some research, go do a dive to see a dive location to get more information. And so I was kind of in and out a lot. And there was a guy named Shea Golan. Now, Shea was actually a Israeli criminal who was wanted by Interpol, wanted by the FBI for a number of major frauds and different things in the United States, who was in Cancun doing dirty work for the Zeta cartel and then conning Americans out of their condo. And what he would do is he would con his way into the condo and break in, and then basically refuse to leave and say, well, by Mexican law, you can't just get rid of me. So it'll take you 3 years to go through the legal process to get rid of me. In the meantime, I've got this beachfront condo that I'm going to live in. Well, I went on a trip. I came back. I caught him. I confronted him. He was a big guy. Had a Rottweiler guard dog and a hitman or basically a bodyguard. Mm-hmm. And when I confronted him, he basically threatened to kill me and said that if I messed with him, they'd find my body in the lagoon out back. Well, I was a street kid. I grew up on the streets. I didn't even think about it. I just went into, oh, hell, you didn't mode. And I basically told him that he had messed with the wrong gringo and that if he didn't get his crap out of my place by the end of Sunday, which was 2 days away, that I would be back and all hell would break loose for him. And so I went in immediately. He basically just ignored me. Actually, he kind of stood back. I had to stand up on 2 steps to talk to him to his face. And so I went in immediately. I turned off his power, his gas, his water. We had a private elevator up to our suite. So I turned off the elevator. So we had to walk up 14 floors. And so while he was there, I was going to make his life miserable. Mm-hmm. And so then I started trying to figure out, well, who is this guy? what are my options? Can I get the FBI to go get him? Can I get, if he's wanted by the FBI, could I get the local police to do something? What are my options there? What are my legal options? I spent some time while he was basically threatening to destroy everything in the condo because I turned off everything, was making it miserable for him. I was ignoring him and saying, you better get out now. And the more I would taunt him, the angrier he would get. And so ultimately, I went down. I even went to trips where there was one night I met with a guy named Jose after hours behind the downtown Kinko's in the alley, where Jose told me that for a mere 25K, they would take him, the cartel would take him into the jungle, because apparently they didn't like him either. That they would take him to the jungle and no one would ever find him, guaranteed. I said, well, what can you offer me that's a little bit less lethal? I'm a Christian and I don't like the guy. I just want him out of my condo. And so we talked about what it would cost to basically deliver him over the border, so that the FBI could get him. And that was pretty expensive. I ultimately I bribed the police to go get him, but the police were basically very lazy and they missed him. He had already left the condo when he did that. So what I did was I took everything he owned. I put it in big garbage bags, including his big giant safe and his hookahs, everything he had. And I basically put it in garbage bags and I put it out on the street. Within 24 hours, there was nothing left of it. The locals had basically just scavenged it, and the safe was basically still there, but it had been pried open and whatever was in the safe was gone. So I cost him everything he had at the time. He was driving a stolen Hummer, and so the police finally caught him about a month later in the stolen Hummer with a gun. So that put him in jail for about 6 months. He had to buy his way out of jail to the tune of like 50K. I don't know where he got the money. I made a profile of his criminal record, his picture, his aliases, everything I could find about him. I put it into a one sheet and I hand delivered it or emailed it to every apartment building, every hotel, every motel, every tourist trap, every condominium, every place within Cancun, all the way down to Playa del Vista says, do not rent to this man. Do not let this man in your place or you will regret it. Here's what he'll do. And by the time I came back after that, he had no place to go. He couldn't get a decent car anywhere because now all the car companies were now aware of what he was doing and stealing Hummers and everything else. He couldn't rent any place. The cartel had basically kicked him out on his can because he was obviously a risk to them now. And he was hawking, had a little vendor booth hawking little bracelets and necklaces at one of the little malls outside in a little cart. And but my wife didn't feel comfortable at that point, so we sold the condo and left because we figured at some point in time we're going to run into him, and we didn't want that to happen. Oh. But yeah, I and I said, dude, I warned you. I was really nice. I told you this was your chance. Leave now, but it's going to cost you more than it's going to cost me. I guarantee it. So so I put Shay. Not only did I shame him in Cancun, I put him as a one of the villains in the Curse of Cortez, just so I can get my twofer in life.
There you go.
So I took care of him in real life, and I took care of him in the fictional world, and Shay got it twice.
Don't mess with the gringo.
Don't mess with the gringo. Don't mess with the little guy.
Now, do you have any more books coming out?
I'm working on my fourth one. It'll be a part of the series of Swarm and the Last Ark. So it'll deal with the AI and prophecy and other world events. I don't quite have all the right information. I usually spend so much time during research, and it's during the research that I'll uncover something that I'll go, ooh, that's the hook. And so I have some things that I want to write about, but I haven't really landed on what I would call my really cool, super irresistible hook yet. But I'm sure I will. So I'm working on the fourth. I've also I do a lot of signing events, probably 20 to 30 a year now. Wow. And I've started a group called the Author Event Network. as a new author, I realized how incredibly hard it is and expensive to buy ads on Amazon or Facebook or YouTube, and how to get enough of that where you actually get a rate of return, where you actually are selling as much and making as much on your sales that you're spending on the ads.
Mm-hmm.
And so the online promotion was so hard that I formed a group. And what I do is I've got about 40 authors in the group now, here in the Seattle area. In Portland, we've just opened a Portland chapter. And we will take them and we'll basically share the cost of a booth or 2 booths or 3 booths, however many people want to show up at local events, festivals, and fairs, where there might be anywhere from 4 to 50,000 people attending. And where every other event booth there will have arts, crafts, clothes, food, honey, knickknacks, all the kind of things you typically see at that kind of a fair. We're one of the only places where we're selling author signed edition books. And we'll have all kinds of genres, from sci-fi to fantasy to memoir to thriller to crime. I don't think anybody writes westerns or romance, but we've got a lot of different genres and other styles. Children's books, personal help, self-help, inspirational books, memoirs of one woman has a memoir of her experience coming to America from Moldova as a mail order bride.
Oh, wow.
So lots of fascinating stuff. And we will oftentimes, we're do really well. We did about 12 events last year, which was our first year. We've got about 25, 30 events lined up for 2023, and we're still growing. And so that also takes up a lot of my time. But it's just like talking to you, but in a more structured way.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely wonderful as an author to actually talk to somebody about not just what's in the book, but what inspired you to write the book.
Mm-hmm.
What were those nuggets of real stuff that made you feel like, okay, I've just got to write about this somehow. What did you discover that made you want to create? And the ability to go and engage readers directly about your book and then have them get a signed copy, and creates a real personal relationship with the author and the reader. And that's been a wonderful, wonderful experience for me. And I can't imagine giving that up. That actually charges me every summer. And it's exhausting. You're hauling tents and tables and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But I'm an author. I don't get exercise any other way. So, and I'm retired, so it's probably a good thing. So this really it's expanding my base. I'm earning a lot of money doing that. I'm reaching new readers I would never have reached otherwise. And talking to readers helps inform me as to what are the things they really like to hear about. Well, how do I build some of that into the next book? So it's been a great experience for that. So, and I'm doing podcasts now to try and build out the PR. I'm hoping to get a TV spot sometime between now and the end of 2023. So I'm kind of if I'm slow in my writing phase because I'm doing research, now's the time for me to spend some time, because the last 3 years have been heads down producing 3 books, and all of them well rated, award-winning books, incredible reviews that compare me. One of them basically said that Dan Brown and Tom Clancy would be proud to consider me a contemporary.
Wow.
Just really great, incredible reviews. And so, but that puts pressure on me to say, well, you can't suck now. Next book better be pretty good, dude. Don't get lazy now. So I'm trying to do the research and the work to get the really really compelling theme out and figure what that is, but stay with the overall themes.
Yeah. Well, you put your heart into it, and just listening to you describe it, you can tell that your heart's in it.
Yeah.
You coming to Austin?
I wish. Not anytime soon. I'm kind of on this is my no travel budget year, because my wife wants to go to Italy some point, and I promised not to spend the money doing other things. I would love to come to Austin. I've always wanted to come to Austin, and I would love to come visit you if I ever get a chance to do that. That would be wonderful.
Man, that would be awesome, because I would definitely show you all the good eating spots around.
I'm there. I'm a professional eater.
Myself, a little too much.
Yeah,
Man. Now, do you have a website?
I do. GuyMorrisBooks.com.
Mm-hmm.
And you'll get not only information about the books and buy links, but you'll what I like to do is fact versus fiction or research links. So when I talk about artificial intelligence and how artificial intelligence, a key risk is that it's learning how to rewrite its own code and writing code in a way that the developers aren't really sure what it did, but it's working for the AI. AI in weapons. And so I'll provide links to it. If I talk about something in the books and it might sound a little sci-fi, I basically provide a link that says, no, there's actually applications using this today. I might use it in a more sophisticated way in the book, but it actually exists today. It's not sci-fi. With Curse of Cortez and with The Last Ark and others, I'll provide a fact versus fiction page so I can go down and say, okay, this is fact, this is fact, this is fact, this is fact. This is only folklore, and I made this part up. Right. So I can be transparent for those who are really interested in learning what the real issues are and real facts. There's image libraries of the actual locations that are used in the book and shots. Some of the places I've been myself, some of them I had to research. And then if we want to see reviews, there's highlights to the reviews, all the major reviews, and then links to the full review. So there's a lot there, and you can buy from my site. And parts of my site, you can actually see a quick profile and picture of most of the authors in the Author Event Network.
Well, I'm sure somebody that's watching this or listening to this is going to be fascinated and want to read the book. I mean, myself, I want to get it and read it. But are you on social media?
Absolutely. I've got a Facebook page, Guy Morris Books, official Guy Morris Books, as my Facebook page. I think my Instagram is, it's author Guy Morris, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, author Guy Morris. And then Twitter is Guy Morris Books.
Okay. Well, I'll put the links in the description so people can find it easy.
That'd be great. I can email them to you. I think I have your email, so I'll send that to you and send you a link. And it's been an honor talking to you. It's been a lot of fun. I hope you've enjoyed it as well.
Oh, definitely.
But yeah, this has been great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Well, I already said that your books ought to be put on film, but I think your biography ought to be put to film as well, because your life is it's amazing. And it's been an honor to have you on the show.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Well, Kyle, I would love to come back if you ever want me to.
Yes.
It's been a pleasure, and if I'll let you decide when we're done. If you have any more questions, or
well, I just want to thank everybody out there. And when your new book comes out, please let me know. I'd love to have you come on and pitch it to us.
Absolutely, it would be my pleasure. And I'm excited about it. I think it'll probably be 2024 by the time the next one comes out. I'm kind of spacing it out a little bit more so I can do more research right now.
I think we should just do a podcast talking about biblical prophecies.
Would love to do that. I can go into a lot more detail about various elements, the probabilities, the likelihood, where we might be going next, how it ties into other key events like climate, even the alien phenomenon and how that might tie in. And so, yeah, I'd love to come back, and anytime I can talk about prophecy is a good time.
Oh, I'll tell you what, let's set it up. You still have, well,
thank you.
You still have my calendar, right?
I do. I'll get on your calendar and give you a little space in between, so you're not back to back on them. But I'll give you a month or so to rest, and then we'll come back and we'll do another one on prophecy. How about that?
Oh, that sounds wonderful. And I also want to thank you folks out there. If you come by here for the first time, I hope you will come back. Please hit that subscribe button for my regulars. I love y'all because you make it possible for me to do this. So until the next one, please take care. Be kind to one another. God bless and peace.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Listen to the Vibes. You can catch us on Buzzsprout or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts, and on YouTube. Follow us on Facebook at The Vibes Broadcast Network